get back into it. Thank you. I've been on a couple. Got as far as, well, it's a long story. We should have a beer about it one day.
That's a good idea.
So, I'll call everyone back to order, including you, Mr. Reid. And okay, so let's get back into it. So, this has come about. There's been previous discussions around where the governance actually starts and stops around some of the decision making that goes on, certainly in regard to resource consents. And we sought some advice, but we were quickly directed to the experts in the matter, and I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Mike Reid to talk to us about it today. And just in a matter of introduction, just tell us a bit about yourself, perhaps, and what I understand you want to get something out of today as well, which I think is quite good. So, welcome. Good morning.
And good morning, everybody. Kia ora. I'm really keen to be here, and thank you for inviting me. For those of you who don't know, I actually have run into many of you at different times over the last couple of decades and running new elected member training workshops, but I'm a principal advisor with LGNZ, and one of the things that I'm responsible for is our governance advice, or have been, and developing it. I prepare the new elected members manual, some of you will have picked up on a regular basis, and for my sins, I'm starting to think about the next version. And one of the things that we're looking at is what's the nature of our advice? What do we need to? What are the kind of issues that our elected members facing, and to what degree is our advice that we're putting out there actually addressing those issues for you? Is it helpful? Not helpful? What do we need to do differently? So, amongst other things, we're starting a process of talking to elected members and senior staff to find what kind of advice do we need to see putting out, thinking about the next election that's coming up. And when Liz talked to me, I thought it was a brilliant opportunity to kind of pick your brains as well as share with you where we've got to on our training.
Just could you move
and
your
I
microphone
need to get
just
closer to the microphone.
Thank
you.
Just so you where we record
You
our
are
meetings
correct,
as
yes.
well. So you need to be on the microphone.
Thank you very much, Peter. So a bit quickly, but I've been with Local Government New Zealand. I was just saying to Alan, end of next year will be 20 years. I have a little bit of institutional knowledge and memory, and my advantage in the organisation is I keep telling everybody the only one knows where the key to the cupboard, which has got the whiskey in it, is, and the other skeletons which are hidden in the organisation. Because being in Wellington, not surprisingly, there's a significant shift around of staff as we move between central government offices and local government. And my background before Local Government New Zealand, I was a policy advisor with Christchurch City. So I did 10 years with them, and before that I worked extensively in the voluntary sector, particularly in the development field. So what I put together is just a few slides, which is very much based around the sort of material we're putting out around what is governance, the relationship between elected members and management, some of the broad principles, and what the, if you like, the Local Government Act and our statutory requirements are. And then what I'd like to do is really open it up for discussion about the sorts of issues that you around the table find in your daily life in local government, and what we can learn from those. How does the legislation and good practice perhaps deal with them? What are the kind of way we address some of those issues that you find, and where are the gaps? Where do we need? And what are perhaps the legislative issues that we need to look at? Because we're always conscious that legislation is always, a number of years behind practice, and frequently things come up that we need to go to the government and say, look, we're going to have to amend this. We have to update this legislation. It needs to be modernised. So just to get on with it pretty quickly. I thought I'd start just with this slide that actually comes from a report from the Office of the Auditor-General, looking at the relationship between councils and their chief executives. And it's based on a survey that they undertook with councillors and with chief executives, and really highlights that there is a good diversity of experience around the country. And what we often find is that the various spaces which belong to management and the space which belongs to governance get mixed up. Now, there's no necessarily right answer, because our councils are a variety of scales. At one level, you've got Auckland, which is a rather big place, 1.5 million people, the relationship, and 9,000 staff, 21 members of the governing body. And at the other end, you've got, say, Kaikoura, 3,500 people, 25 staff, And the relationships obviously are going to be quite different between those two extremes. So there is a grey area in the middle, but what you see from these comments that the Office of the Auditor General picked up is that there is, there's a lot of debate about where that line should be between governance and management. And getting that clear is one of the, if you like, one of the things underlying a lot of our legislation, particularly in the governance field. So let's have a look at where that's taken us. The legislation that certainly looks and gives us a clue about where governance sits and management sits, broadly speaking, are these statutes. The Local Authority Members Interest Act is a big one because that addresses, if you like, the role of, this addresses issues around conflict of interest, both pecuniary and non-pecuniary. I was just saying to Fenton and Liz, one of my priorities at the moment is to try to get the government interested in reviewing that Act, because you'll notice from the date that it's a little bit out of date. And one of the problems we have at the moment is that it's the contracting rule in it simply states that if you are involved in a business which interacts with the council to the value of more than $25,000, you must immediately resign. And $25,000 was probably a much bigger figure in 1968 than it is today. So there's some obvious things that need to be changed there. And the other one that's really messy with that piece of legislation is the fact that it's dealing with non-pecuniary conflicts of interest, which is where it doesn't do so well. The Local Government Official Information Act is pretty basic within the New Zealand system. It guarantees openness and transparency, and it's one of the things which really has set us apart from a lot of local government systems internationally. Many countries look to us for transparency and open government, and much of the reason we do so well, particularly when you look at New Zealand's performance around the Transparency International Index, is to do with the Official Information Acts, both at central government and local government level. The LGA 2002 is fundamental because it sets out, if you like, governance principles, and we'll just touch on those in a minute. Administrative law is basically fills in the gaps between the legislation. That really captures what the judges are saying, what legal, where judicial decisions have got to around, if you like, particularly the role of management, the role of governance, and around conflict of interest and all of those issues. And I always like to mention something we do in our new elected members interest act, the Secrets Commission Act 1910. Don't forget it. It's actually, and that deals again around gain from being in public office. It's one of the things that distinguishes us from a lot of the Australian systems. I get a number of calls from time to time from colleagues in Australian local government associations, and sometimes the question is, how do you deal with conflict around the table? I say, well, chair will obviously have rules. No, I mean physical conflict. So far we haven't had too much physical conflict around our tables. So generally speaking, behaviour here is actually surprisingly good compared to on the other side of the Tasman. Well, it might, Tom, actually be entirely due. We use bigger tables. We should just. That's right. So broadly speaking, this is the kind of picture that we work in our training. Good governance is around good accountability and strategic thinking, supervision, policy setting. That's kind of very much the business of our boards and our elected and our governing bodies. And that's based on the IOD governance advice, and LGNZ is working closely with the Institute of Directors in our training at the moment.
What's your differentiation,
Yes.
external, internal?
Well, basically, I'll just see if I can get back to that. Yes, external being in the public face, if you like. So this is how, and internal is your role in relation to the organisation. And it's quite, I find it sometimes helpful to kind of keep those things in view. The LGA, when we reformed that in 2002, we gave some guidance as to around the kind of different roles of the governing bodies and management, and it didn't say a lot about the role of the elected members. The more recent versions have said more, but it went into some detail about the role of chief executives, so we can work back from that to talk about the role of elected members. But in terms of the governance principles, the critical ones here, not surprisingly, are about that things need to be clear. That seems to happen a lot in our legislation. You need to the rules need to be clear. People in the community need to understand the different roles. transparency and open are fairly basic. We're quite familiar now in New Zealand with ensuring that we run our organisations, structure them, so we separate the regulatory from the non-regulatory roles. And this whole issue about the relationship between elected members and management is effective and understood. Now, unfortunately, these are really easy words to say. Putting all this stuff in practice is often another matter, and that's where it gets much more difficult. The Local Government Act 2002 is, I don't know if you noticed if you're reading it, and which is not so easy these days because it's now actually up to 550 pages. We thought we did really well in 2002 to get it down to 350, but it's been a bit of inflation since then. It's full of principles, and that is kind of helpful, but when you get too many principles, it actually creates additional problems. Section 14 has, I think, about 15 separate principles in it, and here are a few that I pulled out which are quite relevant to this question. They remind us that we have to conduct our role in an open, transparent manner. Again, give effect to priorities. This is the role of governing bodies to kind of give effect to the broad strategic goals that you put in place, effectively, efficiently. It appears a lot. Absolutely, we're familiar with the need that we need to take into account the views of communities. The prudent stewardship. Stewardship is a word that happens a lot within our legislation. And acting in the interest of the region, and that will take you all back to the oath that councillors swear at the beginning when you're sworn in at the start of your term, that you're there to act, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. A lot of people don't realise, but the principles are still quite clear that you need to take into account the social, economic, cultural interests of people and communities. We just replaced the word well-being with interests. I'm not sure that there's a significant difference there. And then we've also got to focus on enhancing quality of the environment. Now, the really important part here is that you actually can't do all of those principles all at once and with equal weight, or you're very lucky if you can. So the last one is probably important, that when you actually, if you like, making trade-offs, you're going a bit more this or a bit that, you have to do that in a transparent manner, which is the kind of first principle. So community can quite see is that you've made a value judgment that this principle is going to probably be the dominant one in this particular decision for these following reasons. Another resource that we use a lot that I found useful is an Australian resource called Principles of Excellence in Public Governance, and their principles are very similar to the ones in the Local Government 2002, and which is probably not entirely accidental. But again, that really focuses on the need for the governing bodies to have that kind of big picture, a clear vision, strategic plan, developed through an inclusive process. And that's about setting the vision, the guidance, and that guides and sets the direction for staff and management in terms so that everybody's clear on where you're going. And again, from this guide, from these principles, again, a lot of emphasis on effective processes, transparency and accountability. And you see the word stewardship coming in there as well. So that raises the question that within an organisation, where does accountability lie? And this somewhat colourful statement, strangely enough, I think comes from the Office of the Auditor General. I'm not sure what they were thinking the day. They probably had a bit too much coffee. But ultimately, governance is, you are where the buck stops. And that's the critical thing at the governance level. And so you need to be sort of comfortable with the direction of the organisation and feel you've got the information so that you can stand up and justify and be held accountable for decisions. And that statement comes from the review that the Office of the Auditor General did into the Kaipara District Council recently. And the interesting thing about the Kaipara District Council, a few lessons I think which are quite relevant, but there were two reviews, and both of them are consistent but interesting. This one here, a couple of comments taken from the review team into the Kaipara District Council, which was established by the Department of Internal Affairs, involved a number of mayors from around New Zealand. And as you can see, they reinforced this distinction between elected members and management. Actually, my note on this when I was reading it through on the plane was to say it's the ideal, but it's a very simplistic model. In practice, we know that the distinction between governance setting direction and policy and managers implementing it, that's the kind of paradigm. But in practice, it's a lot more complicated than that, obviously. Policy is often shaped by how management frames questions. The whole ways in which agendas are set can influence the nature of policy that emerges out of the process. So that it's much more interactive and dynamic than that model says, but that is the basic Westminster model that we belong to and that we aspire to try and achieve. So in the end, that's the way it looks. In practice, obviously, it's far more interactive and engaged. But when things go wrong, and this is based on if you like, the Kaipara failure, they identified a failure of governance in Kaipara, ultimately. That one, the councillors didn't really understand their role. They didn't get, and I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide about what they didn't understand. For example, they identified there was a lack of governance training. So we didn't have any of the Kaipara councillors did any governance training, so they weren't quite sure that you were elected. You've probably been working in a town or city or on the farm. You're suddenly running a council worth millions of dollars. Not everybody's ready for that immediately. Sometimes people will need some extra training, help to understand that role. They didn't do it. Interesting here, they lacked the advice and information that they needed to undertake their fiduciary role. So again, from the elected members' point of view, they should be demanding, actually, we're not getting the quality advice we need to make really good decisions. And clearly, they didn't make that good decisions for a whole bunch of reasons. And what was really interesting from the view of the Kaipara Review team there was that over a period of time, the councillors bunkered down. Life became so difficult, they didn't really want to engage with their citizens. It just became too hard. They left it to management, ultimately, and they just kind of disappeared from view because the issues got so large, there was no easy way of solving for them, or not within the context they were working of. OAG also went and had a very close look at Kaipara, a substantial report, and this really went into very much the contracting situation, what went wrong in terms of the finances and the economic decisions with regard to mangawhai. And a couple of points there I think really interesting. OAG really puts a lot of emphasis on this language that the councillors really need to keep the broad view in mind. So if you lose the broad view, you've got a real problem. They need to focus on setting the direction, policy, making the big decisions, testing advice. And this is where Kaipara really failed. There was no way, the councillors weren't able to test the advice because the advice was coming from the chief executive, and there was no real peer review of that advice. They felt that the councillors had failed in monitoring the activities of management against the outcomes. So again, is there a big strategic picture? Is management taking us in that direction? And they certainly failed to understand the risks. So, for example, when they decided to double the size of the wastewater scheme in Mangawhai, like about a year before the great financial crisis hit, there was no kind of sense that there were some risks in making that decision. And finally, they failed to safeguard the relationship between the councillors' community. So these are the real officers or general's observations of what really needed to happen in Kaipara that didn't. But effectively, their view was that members became too involved in operational matters, and therefore they weren't able to maintain that broad view. And in fact, one of the terms OAG has given us, and they really emphasise, we use sometimes, is the long view. So your job around the table is to ensure that there is a long view and that long view is held to. And this is the real issue about if we get too involved in trying to deal with the detail, who's keeping a view on the long view, keeping an eye on the long view. And you can see this operating in Auckland at the moment in a way. With the Auckland model, what the legislators were trying to do is to create a governing body that wasn't going to be having to worry about, where we're going to put the next library and decisions about the collection or quality of the soccer fields. They wanted to try and set up a governance body where you've got a governing body that can actually just simply focus on the big metropolitan issues facing Auckland. Whether they're doing that very well or not, that's going to be up to the electors to make that decision. But you can see what they were trying to do is to make that really that distinction, so you could have a group of politicians who can kind of ensure the city as a whole is doing well. Just a very quick observation here, because this comes up a lot for us, is that councils are not like cabinets. So there isn't, I'm about to Rick on this one, some advice, but a cabinet has a sense of collective responsibility. Never having sat in a cabinet minute, I imagine that cabinet meetings can be quite lively, and ministers will have their own strong views, but when a decision has been made, people are bound to be bound by those decisions, whereas councils' decisions may often be made on a majority basis. And often the questions that we get asked is, well, I don't actually support that decision the councils make, what can I do about it? Good practice says that we try to cover the process of that in our code of conduct. First point is that many of you will say, well, I can't vote in support of this, I like to vote against it and have my vote recorded. That's a very common thing. People can articulate their own individual views in public, and councillors will do that. Subject, as I say, subject to the code of conduct, because that will kind of spell out that, you know, that these are my views and I disagree with the council, but that is the council decision and the majority have voted for it, and we have to respect that. And obviously people around the governance table can seek to relitigate issues in the future, and another election comes along, you may have another group of councillors stand on a platform to reverse a decision a council's made, and that's kind of good political debate at the local or regional level, which we accept. Yes.
Make a comment. Subject to the code of conduct. Are you subject to the code of conduct once you're out of the council building?
Whenever you are operating in your role as a councillor, absolutely. Yes. So if you are making a comment outside the council building, which is to do as a councillor, then you're definitely subject to the code of conduct. Yes.
Just a question, just going back to Kaipara.
Yes.
You said it impacted. First of all, I'm really interested in the competency level of the Kaipara councillors, but their governance letdown impact on the whole council. So, you know, there's no doubt about it. Everyone thinks about Kaipara as being just incompetent fools, including their executive team. So, you know, everyone
Which
gets...
is, yes, unfortunate, really, yes.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yes.
And we as a group, we have a particular issue that we disagree very strongly on. We have camp here
yes,
and a camp
appreciate
there.
that, yes.
So very similar to Kaipara, really. We can litigate publicly, but still we'll all be, if it fails, if the risks fails, we'll all get in the same paper bag, including our executive team. That's correct, isn't it?
Well,
Same as Kaipara. I mean, I don't
no,
know.
not really, no. I mean, the council as a whole bears the risk as a corporate body. Yes.
The disgrace and shame.
Oh, well, yes, to some degree, but governments, you know, the governments take risks, and governments have to act in the public interest, and everything you do has a level of risk to it, and in some respects, trying stuff and failing may be better than not trying stuff. You know, so yes, everything you do has got a level of risk, and if it fails, I think the whole council tends to be tarred with that. Yes.
Can I just
Yes.
clarify that? So,
Yes.
you know, we're all politicians. We come from different backgrounds. Some of us are doctors.
Of course,
dentists,
yes,
or
and
farmers,
yep.
And same as Kaipara, nobody in Kaipara, from my understanding, had an understanding of sewage systems, or so they totally relied on the chief executives. And you've had another slide up there that we are very reliant on the expertise which comes from our staff through our chief executive to us, and few of us around this table have expertise on dams, which is our issue, which is our Kaipara, potentially. So, you know, it's more difficult than you saying those poor people in Kaipara who have been slammed forever. I don't know what happened there. I mean, I don't know the majority. I don't know what happened. I don't know their level of expertise, their level of competence. But you wouldn't want to try and get a job as another councillor somewhere if you're a councillor in the Kaipara debacle.
Well, the two questions you raised there, the expert report. First off, the last thing I think we want from councillors and your governing body, in a sense, for you to be experts on the fine art of dams. You know, one of the real problems we have actually is, you know, accountants being councillors and then deciding, well, we could fire our accountancy department because I could do the accounts because I'm qualified, or even worse than that is having lawyers around the table, sorry for any lawyers around the table, who decide we don't actually need to pay for legal advice because I'm a lawyer. In the same respect, you know, it's great to have an engineer. The issue we push for governing bodies is to ask the right questions. And actually that's... And to some degree, that's where, from the OAG's view, is that the councillors around Kaipara failed to ask the right questions. And some of that right questions is to say to your manager, which is your right, and in some degree, so I heard Councillor Barker do that earlier, is can I need to know that the advice that I'm getting from my management is correct. And so, you know, it's reasonable to ask that advice is peer reviewed. It's reasonable to ask for contestable advice. You know, so that's your role. Before you make your decisions, you need to be comfortable that you've got the best advice that's available, and that's all you can be really held accountable for. there is always going to be the unknown. Now, so when Kaipara, which is much more complex than perhaps it sounds, and I should point out that Kaipara is actually in a pretty stable economic position at the moment. Level of debt is, on a per capita basis, is below Auckland, it's below Hamilton, it's below Tauranga. The headlines were always pretty extreme and were never entirely correct. But the issue with Kaipara, in some respects, one, is that the councillors never really never challenged the advice that they were getting from the chief executive. I mean, some councillors did. I mean, I suspect when elections are held next year, that there may be some of those former Kaipara councillors will get on with probably a high degree of support because they were constantly questioning the chief executive and the advice they got.
But
Yes.
I hear what you're saying
Yep.
about the independent advice, and that's, of course,
Yep.
very sensible. The difficulty is that almost always the independent advice is going to be coming from a person at the recommendation of the staff.
Well, no, I mean, you have some influence over that. And actually, I have to say, it's not an unusual question for me to be fielding. You operate through your chief executive, and again, it comes to what are the instructions that you ask your chief executive to deliver. So you need, for example, I've got an issue at the moment with we have an issue with just with a small council and a group of councils concerned about an investment in a community facility actually having been sound. And again, similar kind of question, they are concerned that the advice they've got from their chief executive is appropriate. They have asked the chief executive through the mayor to actually seek a third opinion. Now, if you're not happy with the third opinion, you can seek a fourth. So you have some influence about the range of advice that you receive, and you still in the end have to make up your mind whether you've got sufficient information. So that's around this table. That's your collective responsibility to come to that.
But when you talk about obtaining further opinions, that is on the basis of a vote, a majority vote.
Absolutely, Alan. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You just councillors can't just go running off and
Oh, absolutely. No, it's done
say,
through
"Give
the.
me this, get me that."
Yes, no, because again, these are decisions where majority. It's a democratic organisation. You're going to have to convince your councillors that this is an issue, and the council will vote for it. Yes. Yeah, because again, that's a cost. But you as individuals around the table need to be sure that you've got the information you need to make a good decision within reason. Yes.
How many more slides have you got, Mr.
Nearly there. Thank
Okay.
you.
No.
No, sorry.
No rush. I just
No, it's all right,
want to
because we
understand.
could actually spend on topic. No, I had about 20 altogether. Very quickly, when we talk about Ms role, we talk about a representative role and a governance role. And that's one which often gets people trapped up. So your representation role is to represent your constituents around the table, and your governance role is to make decisions for the community as a whole. The district, in this case, the region as a whole. And what's really interesting about your role is you wear both those hats, but every now and then you have to take one off and put the other on. So, for example, in your representation role, you're talking to groups, you're talking to communities, you're getting what's on their mind, what are the issues that are important to them, and you may say to them, I will bring those issues to the table. That's my role, because you're my constituents, you voted me on, I'm going to bring that to the table to raise it. Once it's around the table, however, you switch hats. You've raised it, you put it on the table, but around the table you put on your governance hat. And that's when you are actually thinking about, now, what's in the interests of the region as a whole? And so having brought this to the table, you may actually choose to vote not in support of it, because in terms of the interests of the region as a whole, they may be different. So that's one of the kind of special things, and where you differ from a board in some respects, carry both those roles.
But in
Yes,
saying
indeed.
that, though, you have to bring it to the table without a predetermination on it.
Well, that's
That's the grey area.
it is totally the grey area, Fenton. Yes, but at the same point, and this is a really common one for us. It's the difference between having a blank mind and an open mind. So your political bodies, we expect to have debate around the table. Otherwise, why would we go through the trouble of having elections to bring? This is the whole issue. A good democracy needs to have good debate. But within the predetermination laws that New Zealand has got, you're required to have an open mind, not a closed mind. So you can actually, have quite strong opinions, but we expect that you'll be open to having your opinions changed in the face of strong argument and good evidence. And that's where our rules sit. And
Could I just follow up
yes,
on
Councillor.
that?
just take a hypothetical question. There's a controversial issue in a particular community. There are two clearly different points of view. Two people run for office, one representing view A and the other representing view
Yes.
B. The person representing view A wins
Yes.
on this particular issue. And because they have made themselves very clearly in support of position A, could you argue that they are therefore predetermined? Because that's what I think is underlying this. We can't forget that people run here as politicians and they run on a program sometimes. So having run on position A, how could the person then, following a vote against it, having been elected to office on that, and is it fair for other councillors around the table to say, because you ran on position A, and that's why you got supported, you are therefore predetermined and therefore not eligible to vote?
I can actually comment on